Thanks for coming out on this frigid evening. I was telling Steve, I don't know if I would have come out on such a cold day, but I appreciate your coming out, definitely. Especially to see a middle-aged white guy in a suit talk about politics. I don't know if I have any credibility anymore at all. I don't know if I would listen to me. I think we need different kind of voices, but I'd like to offer a few thoughts and comments, and also I'd like to have a discussion about what's on the horizon, because I don't think anyone really knows, and I think we should listen to each other and get some good ideas about how to deal with the next 4 years, hopefully only 4 years. But a few things. There's a few books up there left, and those books are not for sale. They're actually, I say, practically free. Any donation you want to make to the American Humanist Association, just throw it in the box and the book is yours. The amount is up to you. It's an honor system, and whatever you feel like throwing in there. I would say take the book if you really will read it, or if you know somebody who will read it. It doesn't mean you have to finish it, of course. You could get through the first chapter and say, oh, but don't take a book to sell it on Amazon or resale. So somebody suggested I should sign the book saying not for resale. Anyway, and if you do read one, I hope you enjoy it. My idea is to just get the book circulating. I'm not looking to make a lot of dough. In fact, everything I make off of them is going right to the American Humanist Association, so it's a good cause. I think it's really necessary because there's an urgency to get progressive ideas circulating in this country. It's not, let's put it this way, 2016 was not a real successful year for progressive politics. How's that for an understatement? It's really a time where we have to unify and really develop a strategy. Instead of just ranting and complaining, I think we have to really come up with some ideas and strategies for being much more effective, not just at our political thinking, but at our political activism. And there's a lot of people out there. In fact, I think it's been shown that a majority of Americans would most favor the policy positions of a Bernie Sanders if you just ask them about the issues. Yet those stances are marginalized. Very few of his policy suggestions or social democratic policy suggestions really seem to stand any chance of gaining traction. So where's the disconnect, or why the disconnect? And I think we need to seriously give that some thought and figure out ways of being more effective politically. So these are very troubling times. I think things are very much out of whack, and now we can point to Trump as the obvious example of that. Look at what is coming to Washington soon, but it really goes beyond that. I think, if you think about it, even the Democrats too often, far too often, serve corporate interests rather than the interest of real people, right? I mean, things like NAFTA and TPP and just militarism in general. The Democratic Party is not exactly the party of peace. And even Democrats, look at the Russian situation, how Russia is being vilified, and rightly so. Putin is no Jeffersonian Democrat, but look at what has happened since the end of the Cold War. The Clinton administration had a chance. There was that peace dividend that was talked about. But what happened instead? We brought NATO right up to the border of Russia, and we really almost guaranteed that eventually there would be a new Cold War. And, it's that kind of thinking on the Democratic side, never mind the other side, that has led to where we are now. We've got a spectrum of politics where the left is, far from what most of the rest of the world would consider the left. So, what can we do about that? People talk about this slide towards fascism with Trump, and I don't like to be alarmist, and I don't like to exaggerate. I don't know if there's going to be a slide towards fascism or not. I think there's certainly some fascistic things that we need to worry about. There's a lot of law and order being talked about, and a lot of demonizing of ethnic minorities and that sort of thing. So we certainly should have our radar up. I don't really know if that will happen or not. I don't know how bad things will get. I think there's one thing that we can look at in this country that should give us hope, and that's our tradition of freedom. It's not always handed out equally, and it's not always as perfect as it should be, but we do have a very, very strong tradition in this country of free speech and the right to dissent. People don't always utilize these rights enough, but they are there. Bear in mind that even Scalia, when he was on the Supreme Court, voted in favor of allowing flag burning, as a matter of First Amendment free speech rights. Kids in this country can't be forced to say the Pledge of Allegiance. Even conservatives kind of, at least intelligent conservatives, usually understand the importance of these fundamental constitutional rights. And I think those rights, as long as we preserve them and defend them, should enable us to withstand a Trump presidency, assuming nobody gives them the football that presidents are allowed to have. So, some initial thoughts. Let me first tell you a little bit about how I got involved in the humanist movement, because it has something to do with why I'm here tonight, really. The reason I got involved in the AHA leadership about 10 and 12 years ago was political. My own views, I would consider myself kind of a social democrat. I think American public policy should kind of gravitate in the direction of a lot of what Western Europe, Scandinavia, that sort of thing. And it's kind of in line with the Bernie platform, I guess. And I've been of that opinion for quite some time. I am old enough to remember life in America before the moral majority. When the moral majority came into power in 1980, I was just kind of coming into adulthood then, and it struck me as very odd because I remembered politics without this fundamentalist Christian element. So I thought it was strange, and Reagan got elected, and I thought that was strange, as a lot of people did. But I figured that, of course, the moral majority and the Christian right would just be a passing phase. Like, surely in the late 20th century, ideas like that could not continue to have a lot of power. But lo and behold, as we all know, the moral majority morphed into the Christian coalition, and then before long there are a lot of nonprofit Christian right groups, focus on the family and all these different groups, Liberty Council, things like that. And the religious right did indeed grow into this very, very powerful segment of our culture. And what really pushed me over the edge, finally, was in the year 2000 when George W. Bush became president. Notice I didn't say was elected, because I don't think that's really accurate. But in 2000, the results of that election, it really struck me finally that, wow, this religious right, the Christian right, is not going away. It's not going anywhere. In fact, one of their own is now going to be sitting in the White House, and he's going to be getting his counsel from fundamentalist Christian preachers. In fact, he met with them regularly to get policy advice. And he started selecting graduates of fundamentalist Christian law schools to staff the Justice Department. I mean, it was just one thing after another. And it scared me, as it scared a lot of people. But I looked at it, and to me, it was an eye-opening experience, and I realized, nobody is doing anything to affirmatively push back against the religious right. You had groups like People for the American Way and the ACLU that would kind of play whack-a-mole, and they would fight the religious right on various issues here and there. But there was no movement to just lift up the non-religious demographic, the humanist demographic, as a respectable segment of society. Instead, even liberals were kind of buying into the idea that America is a very religious country and that sort of thing. And my thinking was we needed to raise the profile of humanism and humanists in American culture as a weapon to push back against the religious right, to kind of push them towards the right end of the spectrum instead of that they were becoming the new normal. I mean, they had their guy in the White House even. So that was my thinking. And I thought that the movement was having a lot of success, and I think it has had a lot of success. I'm not here to talk about everything that the AHA and the Secular Coalition and other groups have done, but there's been a lot of achievement over the last few years, including just the growth of the demographic. The non-religious demographic has kind of exploded in this country. It hasn't flexed its muscle the way it should yet, but it will, I think. It will. And that was my thinking back in 2000 with Bush, but you know, the funny thing is the exact same thinking can apply today. You know, if you look at what's happened in America, this you know, anti-intellectual you know, Trump crew that's kind of asserting itself now. What better remedy for that than the emergence of a community that really values reason and science, and that again, raises the idea that you don't need religion to be a good American, that you don't need religion to be good, period. You know, I think this Trump election was kind of an anomaly, I hope. But who knows what the future holds. I mean, he could get reelected in 4 years for all I know. But if you're thinking of the long term and how we can possibly build a movement that can counterbalance this, I think humanism has got to be near the core of it. You've got to have a progressive movement that doesn't cater to religion. Sure, we can let religious liberals in. Religious liberals are going to be an important part of any progressive movement, but it has to really stand for the notion that, you know, we make our decisions by reason, we respect science, and we have progressive values that are so essential to humanism. And if you're familiar with humanism beyond the idea that it's just you know, a non-religious life stance, you know, it's also a progressive life stance that stands for progressive values and a pragmatic approach to things. So if that was my thinking back then, I'm hoping that a lot of people younger than myself are maybe looking for an answer like I was about 15 years ago, and finding humanism as a tool that they can use in the political spectrum. So let's talk about humanist politics a little bit, if we can. One thing that I like to emphasize when I talk about humanist politics is that humanism approaches politics from a pragmatic standpoint. If you look up and study humanism, one thing that you'll find is that it comes under the umbrella, actually, of pragmatism. John Dewey is kind of one of the founding fathers of modern humanism, and he's better known for pragmatism than he is for humanism. Pragmatism is very important because it's a different approach than an ideological approach, where an ideology usually latches on to one primary idea or one primary value even, and lifts that value, that idea up above all others. So if you're a libertarian and you're really an ideological libertarian, you lift up freedom first. It's liberty is the most important thing, and then everything else is kind of secondary to that. If you're a fundamentalist Christian, then obviously your Christianity supersedes anything else. Anything that runs contrary to Christianity, we're just not going to buy it. That's why we have so many anti-science Christians, because their Christian ideology, and that's what it is really, comes before reason and science. That's their belief system. And we could run through all different ideologies, and it's the same thing. Humanism doesn't approach politics that way. Humanism asks questions, very practical questions. How do we want to live? Okay, that's a decent question to ask if you're in the political realm. How do we want to live? How can we do it? And how can we do it staying aligned with our values? And which value is most important? Well, we don't approach it that way. We have a whole array of values, and we approach problems and solutions by keeping those values in balance. And there can be debate about, you know, which value is more important in any particular situation. But we've got our eye on you know, the big question, how do we want to live? What kind of society do we want? You know, instead of being obsessed, well, like a lot of politicians are, well, growth, growth, growth. You know, if the growth numbers aren't right, then, you know, we're failing as a society. Well, you know, maybe not. How about quality of life? You know, maybe we can have higher quality of life for, you know, a wider range of people, and maybe the growth numbers won't be so great. But, you know, if everyone's got a high quality of life, and maybe the growth numbers will be back up next quarter or whatever. But that's the difference between a pragmatic approach to politics and an ideological approach. And the humanist approach to politics is always pragmatic. Lots of room for debate, but it's within a framework of pragmatism. So that's us. Let's talk about them, this incoming administration, Trump. One thing that I would say about Trump that I don't think is said enough is that he is probably not corporate America's first choice, and we should be mindful of that. In a way, Trump does reflect a populist backlash against a system that has been overtaken by corporate power. Now, it's not the backlash that we would have liked, but it is a populist backlash, and we should recognize it as that. It's too bad that he was as successful as he was, but he's on record as being, you know, anti-NAFTA. In fact, this is why, surely why, he carried some of those Rust Belt states. He's on, you know, he bashed Clinton over NAFTA and TPP, things like that. He talked about draining the swamp. You know, he's probably right that the swamp needed to be drained a little bit. Maybe not in the way that he was talking about. In fact, and the reality is with the people that he's bringing into his administration, he's really not draining the swamp a lot. I think a lot of what he was talking about was just talk. I suspect that he will be much to the liking of corporate leaders in this country. He won't challenge their power in a major way, in a systemic way. He may pick fights here and there for political purposes. But look at the people that he's surrounding himself with, right? It certainly shows he's no moderate. You got Pence, Sessions, his education secretary is vowing basically to dismantle public education. So we've got some real issues. And when he was running initially, I actually thought that perhaps he was moderate and he was just kind of running to the right to win the nomination, and that, you know, I was actually thinking, well, he's probably better than Ted Cruz, and he's probably better than, you know, a lot of other people running. Not that I would have wanted him in, but I was thinking, you know, he's a New York cosmopolitan guy. He's, you know, lived kind of a hedonistic lifestyle most of his life. He's never seemed like a Christian to me. You know, maybe he's just playing the game. But the reality, the way that he's setting up his administration suggests that's really not the case. He is, whether he's the real deal as a conservative or not, he's certainly singing that tune and playing that way. And quite frankly, even if he were sincere in some of his challenges to corporate power, his overall strategy is certainly one of divisiveness, thinly veiled racism, not even veiled racism, actually, nationalism, willingness to pander to religious elements, and other extreme right-wing influences. So I really think beyond his policy positions, I think just the temperament of the man has got to concern a lot of us. So generally, I think over the next few years, humanists are going to be on the defensive politically everywhere. And by that I mean in the executive branch with Trump. Certainly we're going to have our fights there. In Congress, both houses of Congress are controlled by the GOP and conservatives. And in the courts, looks like the Supreme Court is going to not get any better, if anything worse. And beyond that, that's the federal government. Keep in mind, really in this country, we're talking about federalism. In the state legislatures, 2/3 of the states are controlled by the GOP. Republican governors, Republican state legislatures. They almost have enough so that they could pass any constitutional amendment they wanted if they got themselves together and really marched the way they wanted to. So think about that. You know, the GOP platform, if you're familiar with it, has some pretty wingnut ideas. That's just what they do when they get together every 4 years and they put together a platform. But you could actually see some of those ideas kind of bubbling to the top by way of constitutional amendment, because they've got 2/3 of the states in their pocket as well, which is what's needed to pass a constitutional amendment. They've talked about doing things, these aren't things that don't make the newspapers, but they have serious policy proposals, such as removing certain kinds of cases from federal jurisdiction so that federal courts can't even hear them, and only letting state courts, Establishment Clause cases, for example, church-state separation. The federal courts can hear those cases only because there is legislation allowing them to hear those cases. But if they want to take away federal jurisdiction and let Establishment Clause cases be heard in the states, I'm sure the state courts of Alabama would interpret the Establishment Clause a lot differently than the federal judiciary would. So it's things like that. There's a lot of trouble on the horizon. So what can we do? What can we do if we want to be on the offensive instead of the defensive? Well, there's always the humanist idea of just doing good and trying to show the community that humanists and non-believers do good things and deserve respect. Fighting for progressive public policy in any way you can, even if the policy has no chance of succeeding. Just getting it out there, trying to force a debate on it, letting society know and letting your representatives know that there are people out there who want these sort of things, who demand these sort of things, objecting to attacks on reproductive rights, objecting to Christian privilege when it's out there, protesting laws based on religious beliefs. Protests, boycotts, that sort of thing are very useful tools when you're in the minority and when you're out of power. Demonstrating. I've long felt that our secular community has not demonstrated enough. I've talked to people at the Secular Student Alliance about this, because students especially should be out demonstrating. They've got lots of time on their hands, right? And I've often said, you know, they should be on these campuses having mock stonings and things like that, you know, just demonstrating against Christian privilege and in favor of, you know, secular ideas, secular policy. And these are things that we can definitely do. There's no reason we can't. We can have advertising campaigns. We can form more student groups. There's certainly plenty of schools out there that don't even have atheist groups or humanist groups, and I really think that's a shame, because there are plenty of atheist and humanist students in just about every campus in the country. And the reason there aren't more groups, and there are a lot more than there were a generation ago. I mean, when I went to college, nobody ever heard of an atheist group or a secular group at a college, but there are a lot more than there used to be. But there really they should be pretty much on every campus now, just as there are gay, straight alliances, that sort of thing, just about everywhere now. There's got to be a realization that the secular movement is a very important element in the progressive movement, and if you want progressive public policy, you've got to, you know, stand up as a secular American, if you are a secular American, and be heard, and, you know, flex that demographic muscle. And I imagine over the next few years we are going to be seeing a lot more of that. When I talk to various secular groups, including the SSA, Secular Student Alliance, I get the feedback that there's growth everywhere. People are just terrified of what Trump and his crew are going to do to this country. And obviously there's the important issues such as global warming, where the secular community really has something to say about valuing science. You know, it's not enough to just say that science is on the side of global warming. Christians can say that. We can say, well, you know, we are a group, we are a segment of society that actually values science as a primary value, that reason and scientific thinking are central to our worldview. So that sort of thing. And then, most importantly, perhaps, at least in some areas, what about running for office? One of the biggest shames, I think, in this country is that there are so many non-religious Americans, but everyone feels that if you're running for office, you have to belong to a church, and you have to point. There's 435 members of Congress and 100 senators. Not one is openly identifying as non-theistic at this time. There are a couple who are non-religious, you know, several who are non-religious. There's one who almost identified as a non-believing humanist, but he kind of backed down. So I don't think anything will make our demographic more legitimate than seeing members of our demographic in Washington, that sort of thing. So easy to say, but it's kind of hard to find people around the country who are members of groups like these who are saying, you know, I'll run for state rep, I'll run for state senator. But we really do need a lot more of that. So, let me just discuss a couple more things about humanist politics, and we can have a conversation instead of a one-way conversation like this. But one thing that I think is often overlooked also is the importance of language and strategy as far as not just humanist politics, but progressive politics in general. Take, for example, the term socialism, okay? I'm kind of ambivalent about the term myself. I consider myself a social democrat, so I guess that falls under the umbrella of socialist, and that's fine. But and the term certainly didn't hurt Bernie Sanders, did it? I think he got a lot of mileage out of it. But these days, you know, what does it even mean? What is socialism today? Chomsky says that Bernie Sanders' socialism is just New Deal. He's a New Deal Democrat. He's really not a socialist at all. He wasn't talking about nationalizing any major industries. He wasn't talking about public ownership of the means of production, which is usually the first way we define socialism. It's kind of an old-fashioned term in a way. There are some little pockets of socialism around the country that are having success. There's a socialist alternative. They elected somebody to the Seattle City Council. You can cherry pick around the country little instances of socialism, organized socialism seeming to have traction, but realistically I think it's unimaginable that suddenly socialism will become a popular term in mainstream American politics, despite the success of Bernie Sanders. There's all sorts of problems with the term. You know, number one, defining it, but even some of its basic ideas, a class struggle, if you've ever read Marx, it's very dense, most of it, doesn't really make sense. The reason I mention it is because there are other ways of bringing about socialist ends without wearing socialism on your sleeve. I think the term egalitarianism is quite useful, or just human-centered public policy. You know, why can't we just have human-centered public policy? Things like that. There are conversations that humanists need to have and need to demand, and we can you know, do them under the Bernie Sanders umbrella of socialism, or we can do it under the umbrella of progressivism or something else. But we really need to emphasize the importance of quality of life. If we're talking about politics, why are we never talking about the government providing quality of life in this country? This is the kind of rhetoric and the kind of discussion we need to demand, instead of having the discussion under the neoliberal, moderate American definition of how politics should be. Last week I put up an article on Psychology Today talking about, how do we even define progress in this country? I would think the number one way of defining progress would be how we are improving our quality of life, right? Technology is something that's existed in modern industrial society since modern industrial society began. So technology gets better. Shouldn't that necessarily mean that quality of life gets better? In this country, we seem to say, well, quality of life is getting better because we have smartphones now. That's your grandparents didn't have this, so your quality of life is better. Well, that's not really, this is progress. It's technological progress, but it's not quality of life progress. I would think that progressives and humanists who want to really engage in politics and lock horns with the Trump crew and the conservative crew in general can demand that progress means a shorter work week, doesn't it? I mean, isn't that progress? If you've got a job where you're slogging off to work, progress means being able to lead a meaningful life and to be, creative and to just be able to live in a way where it's not a rat race, where you're not worried about losing your home. At this point, I would think with the technology we have and with all of our abilities and all of our wealth, we should be able to guarantee that people have health care. It's a right. Use the word entitlement even. Look, boy, haven't they done a great job demonizing that word, entitlement? Well, oh, he's so entitled. Well, that's the whole idea, isn't it? A couple generations ago, people didn't have electricity. People didn't have indoor plumbing. But we feel today that, well, you're kind of entitled to that, living in the 21st century, no matter how poor you are. You should have indoor plumbing, you should have electricity. Well, can't we just keep pushing the envelope? And isn't that something that humanists should look to the political realm to do? We think now that we've reached the point where people are entitled to health care. Generations ago, health care was nothing more than a community doctor who would make a house call and prescribe a few different medicines, but that's about it. But today, health care is this high-tech thing with MRIs and CAT scans and very expensive technologies, but we can't have just a few people having access to that. It's something we're entitled to as a society, I think. We need to challenge language that frames the debate in a way that moves away from policy that does provide those sort of things. How much time? Other things that we can revisit would be ideas such as isolationism. That's an idea that died on December 7th, 1941. There used to be an isolationist element in American politics, quite strong one. In fact, this country really had to get pulled into World War II because people didn't want America being militaristic all over the globe. Ever since Pearl Harbor, isolationism has been off the table as an issue. I think that word is probably never going to be popular again, that America should isolate. It's a global world now and we need to engage in the world, but we certainly need to start questioning the idea of American military tentacles being all over the world. It baffles me when we can rush right up to the border of Russia with our NATO alliance, and yet any slightest move by Putin that can be construed as militaristic is suddenly, puts us on the brink of war. Same thing in China. China moves a few boats around in the Sea of China, and it's practically an act of war as far as we're concerned. And the Sea of China is off the coast of China. What are our boats even doing in the Sea of China? And I'm sure there could be legitimate reasons for it. But just think of the double standard there. Imagine if Chinese boats were, off the coast of Los Angeles, or cruising around in the Gulf of Mexico, right off of New Orleans. I mean, we'd be flipping out over it. But we need to question American exclusivity as far as having the right to march around the globe, doing what we want. And I think most importantly, and this will be the last topic I talk about, we need to really start bringing the issue of corporate power into the forefront. This, in my opinion, is what probably holds back the progressive movement more than anything else. It's the jugular issue. It's the reason why there is no democracy in this country, because corporations run this country. I go down to Washington quite frequently, and I can tell you it's a city filled with lawyers and lobbyists, and 99.9% of them are working for corporations and industries. They're not working for you and me. They're working for major corporations and major industries, and they have the ears of the regulators, they have the ears of the legislators, they have the access that you and I as individual citizens would never have. They have the money to use the courts, they have the money to control the city, and there's just no stopping them. And it's issue number one if we ever want to see an effective democracy in this country. There's a lot of mistakes, I think, that the progressive movement makes in trying to deal with this issue. One thing we need to realize is that corporations, you've heard the term eternal vigilance, that you need eternal vigilance if you want an effective democracy. The price of freedom is eternal vigilance. You should think about that. There is nothing that is more eternally vigilant than a corporation. A corporation is focused on its profits. It's its only concern. It's focused on them 24/7, 365 days a year. If a corporation is a person, and technically under American law, corporations are people, the psychological profile of corporation would be sociopathic and narcissistic. It is totally concerned with nothing but itself, and it promotes itself. It seeks its ends and nobody else's ends, and it will stop really at nothing to get them. That sounds like an exaggeration, but it's actually accurate. In what way is that inaccurate if you think about it? They get what they want, and on top of that, they are extremely well financed. I mean, they're much richer than any individual. The richest individual in this country is still far poorer than all the major, Fortune 500 corporations. It's just something we need to realize. Corporations also, we talk about the 1% in progressive politics. It's us against the 1%. I'd suggest to you that is an inaccurate portrayal. It might be a useful slogan politically, but it's also very misleading. It's us against the corporate sector is what it really is. It's humans versus corporate people. Most wealthy people I know really don't, a lot of them are quite progressive in their politics. It's the corporate sector is much more in control of the policy agenda. That's why we have groups like ALEC, which wine and dine legislators, and they actually write the legislation for a lot of legislators around the country. And they also guarantee funding to legislators by introducing them to major donors, corporate backers. The Chamber of Commerce is another one. This is something that we just really haven't come to grips with in this country. And it's very unfortunate that it's not even on the radar. If you ask even progressives to talk about, what are the 5 most important issues in this country, they'll rattle off various things. Very rarely will you hear anyone say the issue of corporate power. So how do we attack it? That's a real challenge, because in this country, the courts have said that corporations being people, they enjoy constitutional rights just like human beings do. So in order to reverse that, we either need a new Supreme Court or a constitutional amendment. Nothing's really going to happen until one of those 2 things happen. That's a major hurdle, especially today in 2017, with the administration that's coming in and the Congress as it's composed today. It's an enormous task. It's almost hard to imagine, but other hard to imagine political goals have in fact come to fruition, so we shouldn't necessarily give up. None of this is to suggest that I'm necessarily anti-corporations, that we should eliminate corporations and replace them with something else. The reality of modern technological living is that you need institutions to deliver the wonders of modern technology. You need some kind of company or some kind of institution to deliver the electricity, to do all the... So the answer is not to eliminate corporations, but the answer is to raise public awareness about the dire need to control them. We can't have both parties going around saying that we need to deregulate, that we need to let these institutions have their freedom. They've got more than enough freedom, that they are in control as things stand now. And we really need to emphasize the importance of that issue. So, that's about all I had to say. I would welcome, I've thrown a lot out there, and I welcome, back and forth on any of these issues, or all of them, or whatever. Yeah.
Seems like some corporations do have a more beneficent model, like, say, Whole Foods, John Mackey, where the goal is to pay employees better wages, provide healthy food to people. Yes, they want to make a profit, but they also are careful not to damage the environment or damage people, for that matter. Then there's other corporations, of course, at the other extreme, but it seems to me one task would be how to push corporations in the direction of being more like Whole Foods than, say, like ExxonMobil.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think the mistake we don't want to make is to assume that the corporate sector as a whole is going to go the direction of Whole Foods, if you accept the idea that they're as benevolent as you're saying, that they're going to go that way voluntarily. I think, of course, in any society with a whole array of different corporate choices, there's going to be some that find a niche doing that, being the good corporation. But the reality is that you do need regulation. You need to understand that corporations are entities that are extremely powerful. In the founding days of this republic, corporations were extremely rare. Even Adam Smith, who's often pointed to by conservatives as like the guru of all things laissez-faire, he was against the idea of corporations by principle. He was against the idea of separating ownership from management at all. So it's just very important to realize that the modern corporation and the control that corporations have over American society is not something that's quintessentially American. The founding generation was very much skeptical of corporate power. To the extent it existed at all, you needed an act of the legislature just to form a corporation. You couldn't just go down to a government office and file a piece of paper and say you've got a corporation. You needed to go to the legislature and have them pass a bill creating your corporation. You had to prove that it was in the public interest to have this corporation. It would usually be for something like building a canal or building a bridge or shipping on the high seas, which was very dangerous. So you needed the corporate structure to spread out the risk. But it was recognized that a corporation was an artificial, very unnatural entity. If you're into laissez-faire, you should be opposed to corporations as by principle, because they're unnatural. And because they are narcissistic and sociopathic, they will naturally pursue their own interests as much as possible until you've got what we have in America today, which is a society completely controlled by them.
So what form would an amendment take that was trying to rein in corporate power?
It would, number one, state something along the lines that corporations do not have fundamental constitutional rights as human beings do. They have whatever rights we as a society feel they should have in the public interest, and that corporations exist for the public interest. If they're acting outside of the public interest, they can be dissolved, period. That's the way it used to be. That was the way that before they managed to kind of wrangle control, that was the idea, that corporations existed for the public interest. And it would really be a matter of returning to that principle.
And sorry, just to follow up, is anybody, kind of propelling an amendment like that? Or? Yeah,
there's actually a group called Move to Amend, which has a constitutional amendment like that. And there are others as well. I actually mentioned a few of them in Fighting Back the Right. So, yep.
How do American corporations compare to corporations in other parts of the world?
That's a great question. They definitely have more free reign here, although globally, what's happened is, we point to Western Europe and Scandinavia as kind of the nirvanas. It's really not true. Globally, much of the world has kind of gravitated and Americanized. American corporate influence has grown around the world, but in most of the world, they do not have the rights that people have, that they don't stand in the shoes of flesh and blood people and say, we've got the same rights that this person has. So they're more highly regulated and not necessarily more highly taxed, interestingly enough, but they are definitely more highly regulated.
How did they manage to stay uncorrupted by corporations like Scandinavia and Europe? How does the government keep its checks and balances on corporate power, and why have they become corrupted like our government?
Well, that's a great question. I think it really comes down to, from the political standpoint, a recognition at the outset that they need to be controlled. These countries tend to have strong labor sectors, they tend to have stronger unions, and they tend to approach the economy from a quality of life standpoint more. That there are indexes. We tend to point to the growth indexes as proof that the economy is doing well. In Scandinavian countries, they have what's called social progress indexes, or social indexes that they look at to determine whether things are going well or not. So things like that. Yep.
I'm curious though what we can learn practically from recent history, like with Indiana, the freedom of religion bill there, but to deny services to LGBT communities. My understanding was that corporate pressure not to do business in Indiana helped sway some of the decisions to back off on that. So I'm just wondering, as a
North
That was
Carolina.
in North Carolina.
no, Indiana.
No, I think.
Indiana,
Yeah.
hence,
Also in North Carolina.
North Carolina was trans and bathrooms.
Right.
This is Indiana, specifically the religious freedom bill
Yeah.
that would have, defeats it.
But I don't
Yeah.
think that's been, undone, whereas in North Carolina, they did vote to try and undo that with their gubernatorial election.
No, in Indiana, they backed off on it due to corporate pressure, correct?
I believe you're right, and
Yes.
I think the point I would make when you point to something like that, okay, these corporations stepped in and pushed social policy in the right direction.
Yeah.
Sure, but why did they do it?
That's my question.
They did a calculus that determined, that it was the wiser thing to do from a business standpoint. So sometimes what is good for business is also the social outcome we would want. I'm not saying, it's not a situation where, anything a corporation could possibly want is not what we want. It's not that simple. There certainly are social outcomes that corporations are going to do. But the important point to realize is that everything they do is for the profit motive. There is no inherent benevolence in a corporation. There might even be good people working for corporations, there certainly are, but the systemic structure is such that those good inclinations get suppressed almost always when they come into conflict with the corporate motive. Just think of, there's numerous examples. A tobacco executive, would not want his or her child smoking because it's cancerous. You don't want that. But that same tobacco executive will go to work, and if there's a way to market the product, even in this country, that they would market the product. They've probably given up for the most part trying to market to children here. But if there's a country overseas that allows marketing cigarettes to children, they will do it. They will do it because it's good business. And they're going to lobby in those countries to keep those laws as long as they possibly can. CVS Pharmacy said they were going to stop selling cigarettes, and we think, oh, what a great corporation. They run the numbers and show how much cigarette business they're going to lose. But surely there was a calculation done showing that from a marketing standpoint, that is a tremendously progressive. You're going to really resonate with the right demographic by being the major pharmacy company that doesn't sell cigarettes. The soccer moms are going to love you. Surely that calculation was done, and that's why they did it.
A similar calculation might be, Target having gender-neutral bathrooms, being accepting of trans and LGBT,
How you want to portray yourself publicly, yeah.
Although it is nice to see it, even if it is a calculation, it is still nice to see, I think.
Yeah.
Just, even if it's not benevolence.
Yeah.
It seems like you're comparing a tobacco company. That's like one of the most heinous corporations that exist. I mean, from my perspective, they should all be outlawed, really, because they're selling products that are harmful to people. But a lot of corporations make products that are useful to people. So there's going to be, a common interest between the corporate profit and the public's benefit from that, from those products.
Of course, and the point is, and I really was careful to state this early on, is that I don't think any rational person would suggest the elimination of corporations. Not at all. We need institutions to deliver goods and products, and we want most of the goods and products that they produce. But there's no need to hand over the reins of government to these corporations. I use the tobacco example because it's such an obvious, easy example, but this sort of thing happens throughout society in many different levels. Whether you're talking about pharmaceuticals, whether you're talking about the auto industry, it's well known that during the Eisenhower administration, the auto industry basically killed public transportation in this country. We had an opportunity to build a tremendous public transportation infrastructure, but that ran contrary to the interests of the auto industry. And the auto industry, had a lot of muscle, and The thing is, we can have all these goods and services and have a government that does not necessarily cater to corporate interests, but instead caters to human interests. We the people, that delivers. Why don't we have single-payer health care?
We don't have all that stuff because people need to be elected and they need lots of money. And that's the connection. The corporations are there to make money. They're not altruistic. I like my iPhone. I like Apple. They're there to make iPhones and other products, and they're there to make money. They're not people. And they shouldn't have constitutional rights, like you say, like people do. But they're there to make money, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's the connection, what you just said, to government, to the lobbyists, to the people that are getting elected, and they owe these people. If I give you, millions of dollars to be elected, I owe you. You own me. That's the problem. That is the connection. That's the problem. It's not the problem that corporations make money. That's what they're there to do.
Right, and that's why I think it would be naive. It might be naive even suggesting that we can control corporations because they are that out of control. They have that much power over all branches of government.
It's the electoral system that's the problem. That's the problem.
Yeah, but the electoral system, to reform that, you would need to reform corporate power because you can't realistically you can't take corporate money out of the electoral system now because corporations, with Citizens United and other decisions, corporations have the right. And one other thing that I want to point out, and this is important, we talk about socialism and, is socialism the answer? I'd suggest to you that, the basic idea of socialism is public ownership of, wider ownership of corporations, of the means of production. But if corporations were owned by their employees, they would still be as dangerous as they are now, except they would probably be a little bit more friendly to labor. But they would still pursue their profit motive relentlessly.
That's their whole reason for being.
Right.
So
and that's,
I think we need term limits, and I think we need to have an election that goes for a year and a half. You look in Europe, the government falls, the guy resigns, they call an election, within 3 months they're done. Whether it's a good electorate and good prime minister that they elected, I don't know. But the whole system that we have here is ridiculous, and it's all based on money, money, money. And until you break that connection, there's nothing that's going to change.
Oh, there are people who are suggesting publicly funded elections that would take, that all elections are being publicly funded by the government.
But it doesn't happen.
Right, and therefore there would be no money from outside sources. You would only be able to spend what the government gives you for specific elections.
And you would almost certainly need a constitutional amendment for that as well, because you'd be eliminating that right of free speech. It's been interpreted that to donate to political campaigns is a free speech right, so publicly financed elections would eliminate that. Yeah, in the back.
Even with some kind of system where we had a lot of control over corporations, they still make a lot of money and can influence the people's decisions. For example, corporations, the petrochemical industry, funded foundations to fight the idea that there is global warming. That can happen independently of an election campaign, sway huge swaths of the population to vote against anything that would affect that, even if they had some sort of effective electoral control over corporate power. So I don't know exactly how any concentration of great wealth isn't dangerous.
Right. I think
don't know if you agree with that, but I mean...
I do agree with that, and that's really the point that I'm making, is that corporations are going to exist and they're going to have probably more influence than we would want them to have in any context, which really points to the need to be aware of the need to regulate them and to control them. And it is more than just electoral politics, so that's a huge part of it. huge part of it. But, you know, they need to understand that they exist for the public good. Right now, that isn't even the standard. A corporation can be adjudicated as not being in the public good, but it still has a right to exist. So it goes beyond just electoral reform, and it goes to the need to regulate them and have it be understood as a societal norm that corporations should be regulated. Yeah. And then you, sorry.
Corporations seem to be #1 worry evil of the next 4 years to worry about. What would be #2 after corporations for the Trump presidency of 4 years? What comes? What's the thing that scares you?
Yeah, I wasn't necessarily ranking things, although I do think corporate, but I think in this day and age, I think you know, war is always probably the #1. You know, I'd be very, especially with his temperament. I mean, if you follow him on Twitter, he's not really the kind of guy who is the perfect statesman for 21st century nuclear power.
He's not statesman at all.
Yeah, but I'd be very concerned about a war.
I think I'm sorry I asked the question.
But I think something could happen very fast too. You know, a war that we didn't even see coming. With somebody like Trump, I could see just waking up one morning and finding out that, you know, something has hit the fan in the Pacific Ocean or something like that.
He's got a missile heading to Meryl Streep.
Yeah.
So I guess my question can kind of piggyback on both of the last two. How do we fight like the ground game? So when someone wants to argue that Trump and corporations should be deregulated for jobs, and they're like parroting the Republican basically platform or whatever, what advice might you give so that we can help show them that they're talking about not helping their own self-interest, and they don't see that? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I do, definitely. And I think it's important to remember the importance of language. And to, you know, there's been a lot written ever since the Bush administration about rhetoric and you know, the right. George Lakoff wrote a book about 10 years ago called Don't Think of an Elephant. And of course, when you say don't think of an elephant, the thing that you visualize in your head is an elephant. And you know, there's a lot of political scientists and pundits have talked about, well, how do we frame the progressive agenda? Because it's a great agenda, and people say they want it, but it doesn't seem to be successful. I think the important thing is to get people focused on the reality that quality of life is something that they should expect from government, and that they should expect from society this day and age. That too often, if we feel that government is alienated from us, or that we're alienated from government, and we are, I think it's because that, you know, we don't have control of it, that it's working for someone else. And I think Bernie tapped into this quite a bit. I mean, Bernie is a very good, you know, politician as far as pointing out this sort of thing. He probably wasn't the ideal person to deliver it. You know, he's an old man, and he, you know, it's
crazy.
Yeah. But I think somebody with that message and the wisdom to get people to look at the possibilities that you know, that they do have the potential to take the reins of government back, but that it all comes down to, you know, it's not the 1% that has the reins of government. That's the thing that really gets overlooked. It's always the 1% that's demonized. I think the 1% are the greatest beneficiaries of corporate power, but it is corporate power that has the reins of government. The 1% is kind of incidental. We need to get people looking at what the real problem is and what the real possibilities are. that we live in a very modern, industrial, technologically sophisticated society, then why are we running ourselves ragged? You know, what?
Because I think money and quality of life are synonymous in our culture, right?
Yeah.
And it's really not. And I think people just need to have that conversation.
Yeah,
more.
but there's something like 40% of this country has a net worth of 0 or less, negative net worth. You know, so if money's so important, we're not doing a very good job achieving it. And the thing is, if we have social expectations of certain things being entitlements, then net worth is less important. You know, if everyone's getting health care already, then having a low net worth is a little less important than if you need income and assets just to get health insurance. So the ironic thing about America is that we have a lot of poor people, and not only are they poor, but they don't even have a lot of guarantees that poor people in other countries have. And I think we can enlighten people if we use the right arguments and the right discussion points to the realization that that doesn't have to be the case, that we can even the playing field. And I don't know if, you know, this class warfare against the 1% is really the way to do it. You know, like, oh, you know, look at them, they're in yachts. Well, you know, we should have less wealth disparity, no question about it. And, you know, there's something to be said for taxing the rich, definitely. But the rhetoric that we use is distracting from the real problem. We're talking about these rich people, and yet we glamorize them too. Yet the real problem isn't being discussed.
If I could just push back a little bit, we have people like the Koch brothers who use their vast wealth personally to fund the kind of things like programs that would throw climate change to death. And if those people were properly taxed and didn't have billions of dollars extra laying around just to throw into those kinds of things, that wouldn't necessarily be as big an issue. So not taxing those individuals actually does in fact contribute to their own corporate's power, because they act outside their corporation to do these things.
Yeah, that does happen. I think it's kind of interesting, though, that the number of villains that you can, at least high-profile villains that we can point to, first of all, I'm all in favor of taxing, you know, the Koch brothers. A more equitable tax system is, there's no question about it. What I'm saying is that the political focus that's necessary to actually achieve it, I think, you know, this hammering away at the 1% as the bad guys, there certainly are bad guys among the 1%. And all of the 1% should be paying more taxes. But the problem isn't really the 1%. The 1% is kind of the result of the problem, I think. The problem is that, you know, the Koch brothers are part of the reason that democracy is failing in this country. But you know what, the Koch brothers are, and people like the Koch brothers, are inevitable in a society like ours, where there's the real problem is that we have a government that's controlled not just by the Koch brothers, but by Lockheed and Boeing and General Electric, and those by far are flexing muscle on a daily basis all over the country. I mean, the Koch brothers are two individuals, but look at the army of lawyers that every one of these Fortune 500 companies have that are working constantly for their interests. And they're lawyers, they're lobbyists, they're public relations people, the immense...
but it's the 1% who run the corporations.
I would say the Koch brothers have, you know, Americans for Prosperity with ground organizations in 30 or 35 states and funding the Tea Party, you know, so-called grassroots movement.
Yeah.
You know, so their private power, you know, it's a non-virtuous cycle with corporate power.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm not suggesting that the power of rich individuals is a non-issue, but what I'm suggesting is that we're always talking about the 1%, like they are the ones pulling the levers, you know. They are, in a way, but there are systemic issues. The question is this: is the problem in this country that we have a wonderful system, but there's a few evil people who have kind of hijacked it? Like, darn them, you know, if they just weren't bad people, we'd be all. Or is there a systemic issue? That's really, and there is a systemic issue. We have a system that allows corporate power to run amok. And you can even see how it happens, because corporations do pursue their interests. And since they pursue their interests, they use their resources to pursue their interests. So back in the day, they weren't very powerful, but they used their resources to pursue their interests. And they're eternally vigilant because they do it all the time. That's why they exist. They do it when you're home celebrating Christmas, or when you're home, you know, well, we don't celebrate Christmas. When you're home, you know, at Thanksgiving dinner, you know, or when you go home, they are still focused on their interests. So their power grows and grows and grows until then they're becoming multinational. And this is, you can see the progression from the Carnegie era, where there were quaint corporations that were, you know, too powerful, but there were just a few of them, you know, the railroad companies, a few others, you know, steel was big, but until, you know, what we have today. It's a progression, and it's systemic.
That's the nature of capitalism. So what is the alternative? Communism? That didn't work.
That's a false choice.
Social model. He's already pointed to the Scandinavian countries, they're capitalists.
That's what, all right, go ahead.
He's pointed to the Scandinavian countries, they're all capitalist. And yet they have a more social.
I don't think that, I think those are held up as I think there might be better quality of living there and more equality, but they're not perfect either.
No, well, we're human, you know, I don't think any society.
Whether a corporation, it's not about whether they have been organized around making money, it's a question of whether they have political rights.
Well, whether they're
I
regulated.
disagree with that, but I don't see what alternative are you recommending then?
Small atomization, make it back to close to Adam Smith.
Yeah. I mean, I could go back and draft the Constitution for us, but I think something along, you know, a socialistic system that at least delivers social democracy. I'm not suggesting abolishing private ownership or even the corporate structure, but you know, an egalitarian system.
But you said corporations are necessarily not egalitarian.
That's why. That's why they need to be controlled. See,
I'm not disagreeing with that either.
When you have
capitalism, this is what it ends up as.
You know, we can't blame corporations for doing what they do because it's what they do naturally. It's like letting a lion loose in the city and saying, "Oh, that lion." No,
We're not controlling the line.
Right, it's the people who are we have a responsibility to control corporations. The laws once were such that corporations existed only for the public interest, and you needed special permission just to form one. I'm not saying we should even go back that far.
The Rockefellers, the Mellon, all those people back then, they wanted all those robber barons. The people practically were in poverty. They had nothing to eat. And when they unionized, they took the soldiers against the unions. I mean, it's just the nature of capitalism. I don't disagree that they need to be regulated, but that is certainly not where we're headed now.
Oh, I agree. That's right.
It's a disaster.
Can I suggest sort of a friendly amendment to your analogy about the lion? I think the problem is we've all just sort of grown up in a society where corporations are just assumed to be this natural thing that already exists the way it is and can only exist that way. But it's not a lion that's on the loose. We have created this creature. We built this thing. It's like a lion robot. And if we change the rules of what makes the lion robot work, then it's something else. It's like a nice cat that we can pet. Or whatever that helps us. You know what I mean? It's not necessarily that these are uncontrollable forces that we have to either destroy and kill or...
So we need a bunch of mecha lion tamers in Congress.
Yeah. The problem that you have is the Supreme Court has ruled that they're people.
Right.
But we created them through our laws.
Right. They're not.
And so they are not people. We get to regulate them. We get to say what they do and what they don't do.
That's right, and I'll even point to a little bit of history on that. The idea of a corporation being a person actually isn't so crazy. In fact, I would actually agree with it, believe it or not. The word corporation, the word root for it, comes from the same root as corpse. Okay, what is a corpse? It's a body. Okay, so a corporation is an artificial person. That's the whole idea of it, is that the reasons corporations were created originally is so that you could have an entity that is like an artificial person that, unlike other business structures that preceded corporations, has the right to sue and be sued on its own, so that the owners aren't responsible. The corporation, it has the right to enter contracts on its own, so that the owners of the corporations aren't liable on the contracts the corporation is. So the idea of a corporation is to be an artificial person. The problem came when the law progressed. It started using just the word person instead of natural person, okay? Because when corporations were first created, to differentiate between corporations and when we meant only humans, we would say natural persons instead. But if you said just person, you meant corporations, it meant any kind of person, natural person or artificial. And that's where the law just took off in the wrong direction. It started treating, we didn't use the word natural person as disciplined as we should have, not us, but our predecessors. And therefore we started creating this body of law that interpreted rights being for all persons, not just natural persons. That's why one chapter in Fighting Back the Right is called Of People and Humans. And the idea is that, there's humans and there's people. And one group is bigger than the other because corporations are included in the group of people. Yeah.
I was curious, this is changing the subject somewhat, but you mentioned about, when you talk about isolationism and you were talking about U.S. projecting power in Asia or near Russia. U.S. isn't there to colonialize or to pursue its own interests. It's really there to protect the rights of countries that have been intimidated or even conquered by other countries. I mean, when we're, for instance, we just unloaded 300 tanks into Germany that are going to, the Baltic states. I mean, those countries have been dominated by Russia for years. Unless you want to grant Russia a sphere of influence to suppress democracy in those areas, then who else is going to do it? I mean, there's no other country with the military force of the United States that can protect these countries. In Southeast Asia, in the South China Sea, we're not there again for our own interest. We're interested in keeping the shipping lanes open. We're interested in protecting the Philippines, Japan, all the countries that surround it, so that China doesn't engulf their rights.
Well,
and the Koreas, South Korea.
That's a little further north.
I'd suggest that we're definitely there for our own interests. I mean, if the chief exports coming out of those countries were bananas or coconuts, I don't think we would, have any interest in protecting the area at all. I think we're certainly protecting our own, and mainly the interests of our corporations, quite frankly. I mean, not that we want people all over the world being...
What corporations do we have in the Baltic states, next to Russia?
Yeah, but we're protecting the corporate power for free trade, for example, and trade along all of those, every area you just talked about. Corporate interests exist because they want to be able to trade and what have you. that's all part of corporate interests.
Yeah,
Well,
and
NATO is
not
not a
to be too
corporation.
cynical, but I think, you know, just militarism for the sake of militarism is great for business, okay? So if we can paint Russia...
Military-industrial complex.
Yeah.
Yeah, Putin's doing all right with that, militarism for the sake of militarism, militarism for the sake of his own country. It's not like he's, you know, the offended party here. He's been encroaching. He took the Crimea from Ukraine.
He
So
also stirred
he's
up
no
a lot of
innocent.
trouble in eastern Ukraine. I mean,
The question is, how much should our country be involved in solving all the world's problems?
We're not
We're not
solving
solely
all the world's problems. Look,
involved.
we didn't solve the problem in Syria, and look what happened. It's
we sat on our lawn, we sat
Well,
on
I
our...
should say, in trying to solve the world's problems. I mean, how many of these military ventures have got to be on our
as
mind?
many as are necessary
Well,
to protect our interests. And
We gotta
the
be
interests of
pragmatic too.
democracy.
I think we have to be pragmatic on what battles we pick, but I think we can. For instance, in Syria, we have let Russia dominate the playing field for a really long time in that area. So they're backing Bashar Assad. So that's, I mean, if you were thinking pragmatically, you would not want a man like Bashar Assad and his regime ruling Syria. And I mean, look at Aleppo. Look at that whole area. It's just, you can decry militarism as much as you want, and I'm all for decrying militarism for the sake of militarism. But I think, like you said, we have to do good in this world. We've got to look at the human picture. We can't just, I'm not even talking about this from a corporate or military standpoint. I'm just talking about
There's
human
many
empathy.
presidents that have said the
Human
best
empathy.
way to preserve peace is to be ready for war.
Now, I'm not even talking about war. I'm just talking about humanitarianism.
I'm going to go over here.
Hi. Given that there is not a major U.S. party that has a human-centered platform, not even rhetorically really, or at least genuinely, and given that humanism is really a comprehensive, it easily becomes a social philosophy, you know, that could guide politics. As you were demonstrating, there's basically not an issue that humanism can't be applied to. Do you think that there's a viable opportunity for a party that maybe is not explicitly humanist in terms of its identity as humanist, but at least in its platform has a humanist platform? Because I think that it would occupy a unique space. Even rhetorically, I think that a lot of the things that you said today are not things that the Democrats say, but I think that a lot of people would appreciate hearing them, especially if we didn't attach some partisan identity to these ideas.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, and I don't pretend to, know the answer to it. Really, in a sense, what you're suggesting is, what's the best vehicle to try to do these ideas? A third party, an existing third party, or a new third party. There's always the option of trying to take over the Democratic Party, which is, I don't think, such an outrageous idea. I mean, if you're saying we're going to kind of take over the country with a third party, that sounds harder to me than taking over the Democratic Party and then taking over the country.
Christian Wright took over the Republican Party, so
Yeah. Well,
it would be easier to do than to keep the third party.
Yeah, and I don't pretend to know what the best approach is, but I do think if we're going to be working in third parties, I think we really need to think about what we want that party to look like. I've checked out the Green Party, and I agree with much of its platform. I think it's a wonderful platform in a lot of ways. It's got some issues, but realistically, it just seems like it's a very ineffective party, and it seems like the people running it aren't very politically savvy. They mean well, and it's too white. It's not diverse enough. Excuse me.
Third parties just split the liberal vote, so, which strengthens the opposition.
And that's why I also brought up the whole idea of socialism, because there's this socialist alternative and other, socialist third parties, but to me that just seems like, you're going to have the appearance of a crackpot if you, really try to get too far with that. But who knows? Maybe somebody, some charismatic figure will come along and, take one of those parties and really turn them into a viable alternative with a great grassroots network. But, I think grassroots organizing is very important. Bernie has shown that, and frankly, Obama showed that in his getting elected. And I think third parties need to look at not just the top of the ticket, but they need to really look at getting people elected locally. And the problem in this country is, there are very few third-party elected officials, even like on city councils. And you point to the one out in Seattle, Kashama, I think is her name. Yeah, but I think the interesting thing is she's so unique. We have to point to Seattle City Council, one member, as an example that it can happen. So maybe that's kind of an example that it can't happen very easily. It might be better to just kind of radicalize the Democratic Party, if you will. Radicalize in a good way, not a violent way. But I really don't pretend to have the answer to that one. I think any ideas should be explored. I've thought about the idea of a humanist party. I think it's kind of cool, but I think it's more kind of cool sitting around, shooting ideas out.
Public office?
Yeah, it's hard enough to get people to identify as humanists just culturally, never mind politically as well. Maybe politically would be easier than culturally, but, so many non-religious Americans don't even know what humanism is and don't identify as humanists. So I have a hard time taking the leap to say that even though that's the case, politically we could make it happen. It's probably not.
Maybe one more question and then
okay.
We're going to break up.
Right here.
I just have a comment to make. In this state, there are Republicans and then there's Democrats, and then we do have a progressive Democrat group that does fund progressive Dems to get into public office.
Yeah, we have that in Massachusetts as well. Progressive Democrats of Massachusetts, it's called. Yeah. Okay, well, thank you all very much.